and hopefully you all heard recording in progress. So welcome to Grief and Loss in Life or Death, Life and Death. We're going to chat about a few things tonight. We're going to talk about understanding grief. What is grief? How does it show up? What are the variety of types of grief that we might run into? My intention in this part is always to bring information that really normalizes what this experience of grief is. Humans experience grief. If you love, you will experience grief. And we live in a society that maybe doesn't do that so well, the honoring of grief, the acknowledging of the normalcy of it as a human experience. And so my intention in that first part is really to bring information to normalize, to give us vocabulary. There's such power in words and being able to articulate what's going on for us and in the lives of the people we see and love. So that's my intention with that part. And we'll be talking about living with grief. What does it look like? How does it feel? How does it show up for us? And how can we live with it in ways that are very honoring of ourselves and that allow us to be with and move within and move through it in ways that are hopefully the most helpful, and I'll use the word healthy for want of a better phrase. The next part we're going to talk about is responding. How do we respond to others in our life who are grieving? All of us know, I'm sure, many people who are dealing with grief at one time or another, and it can be very difficult to know how to respond, how to be there for them. We're going to talk about that, and we'll also talk about how to respond to others when you are the griever, how to communicate what you need, or how to set boundaries against people who maybe aren't always as helpful as you need them to be. And then lastly, we'll just chat about some resources, and then I will pause the recording and move into a question and answer time. So we have an hour and a half together, and let's get in. So I will just say, sorry, another piece of housekeeping. If at any time the box that has our faces and the black squares in it is in the way of content, you can actually put your cursor on that and drag it across the screen as you need be. So a little bit of information about me. This is me. I won't read it to you. Suffice it to say, I am a psychotherapist, a registered psychotherapist. Much of my work is in the area of grief, and even often when people come with other concerns and other presenting issues, grief is present. There are no humans that escape life without some sort of loss, whether that be the loss of the life of the people we love, whether that be loss of relationships, loss of dreams and plans, loss of all sorts of things. So it is truly my privilege to get to work with people and their loss and their grief. I am a big, how do I say this? Not a big fan of grief, that's the wrong word, but I really have learned to make friends with grief, I guess is the way that I would say it. I have had experiences of grief in my life, losing people who were very dear to me, relatives, losing beloved pets, which, we're going to talk about later in the presentation, sometimes is not seen as a really valid reason to grieve. And yet for many who are pet owners, those pets, those animals have been in your life for many years, day in and day out, often more than some humans. And the grief when one of our friends dies is real and it's valid. I've had my own experiences with fertility issues and moved through times of great grief, letting go, grieving the loss of planned futures, the loss of dreams and hopes, the loss of jobs, the loss of friendships, the loss of romantic relationships. These are part of being human in this life. None of us escape. If we love, we will experience loss and grief. And that just is a part of being human. And so it really is one of my loves, to learn about this, to learn how it impacts people, to learn how we can show up for each other and for ourselves. So I hope that the information tonight will be helpful for you. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention here, I just said that at the end of my little blip there. We're going to talk about anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is when you realize that you could lose someone or something that you love so much. I know that one very well. Vicarious grief, how we feel grief when someone else we love is grieving. Being in COVID brought up vicarious grief for a lot of people. Even if you didn't lose someone, that experience of grieving on behalf of someone else or feeling their grief, very, very real. And the ending of professional relationships, which is something that we are taught in school and experience as therapists, but I'm not sure if people know that therapists grieve the ending of professional relationships, that when a client and therapist end their time together, even when it is done from a place of wellness and health, and that person is ready to go and be in the world without support, that there is loss, there is grief. It is the ending of a relationship. So another part of grief that I've learned to make friends with and be aware of. So I just want to share that with you. I'm not an expert in grief, but it is a thing that's dear and near to my heart. So let's talk about understanding grief. Grief does not end, but it changes. It is a passage. It's not a place to stay. Grief is not a sign of weakness, nor a lack of faith, but rather the price of love. So tonight I want to talk with you about life losses and death losses. Death losses are often what we relate to in terms of grief and loss. Of course, people that we love, they die and they are no longer in our lives, and we miss them and we grieve, and that's really real and valid. But something that doesn't get talked about quite as much is life losses. And I love that phrase because through all of our lives, there is a tremendous connection with the things that we lose. Things come to my mind when jobs change, either because of losing your job, maybe because of illness, you have to leave your job, even retirement, the ending of your job. There are losses in those changes. Even if the change is really positive, there are losses that need to be grieved. Loss of identity is a huge one, either during retirement or if you have been asked, you don't have your job anymore, usually not of your own choice, a real loss of identity. Although I suppose even if it is your choice, if you've spent a certain number of years under that one title, that identity, it's a significant shift. Loss of relationships within those workplaces, loss of rituals, loss of routines, loss of knowing, what do I do in the morning when I get up and I no longer have a place to go, even though, perhaps you balk against your Monday to Friday 9 to 5. When that's taken away, sometimes there can be grief and loss involved in that. This is thinking about in our life when people we love are still in our life, but are sometimes altered and changed. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide, actually. But thinking about if a person you love has had a brain injury, or a person you love has had a significant physical disability suddenly and life has changed dramatically, or a person you love has dementia and they are changed, your relationship is changed. These are life losses because the person continues to live, and yet those losses must be grieved. They must be acknowledged for us to be able to really honor and move through. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. Often when there is an injury or a change that is outside of our control, there's a loss of innocence, a loss of trust. I think about COVID and how there was this, for many people, a trust that life was carrying on as it should, that life was to a degree within our control. And very suddenly across the world, it became obvious, and there was a loss of innocence, a loss of trust that life would carry on, that we were safe. Not that everyone had that experience, but I did hear that a lot. Anytime there's a situation where there's a loss of trust, a loss of innocence, any trauma that changes the way you see yourself, the world, or other people, there is a grief there, a loss of what was the innocence. I spoke earlier just about my own experience, the loss of futures planned, the loss of dreams, lives intended. I can imagine many of you have examples that I'm not even touching tonight, but you can think of as life losses. And I just wanted to bring those into the conversation here. And so let's talk about these types of grief. So the first here that we talk about is ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief. And I'm going to read some definitions because I want to get the wording right here. Ambiguous loss and grief is grieving someone who is still alive. They've become someone we may not know or recognize. They do and say things that they never would have before whatever came along that has changed them. Examples of this might be loved ones who do have dementia, Alzheimer's, a brain injury, or cognitive impairment. An example of this might be, again, as I said, people who have a physical disability where life has changed dramatically. And even if cognitively they're not altered, life is altered. People who live with post-traumatic stress disorder or a sudden onset of a mental illness, there's a significant shift and this ambiguous loss that the person is still alive, and yet the person that you loved, it seems that they may be gone. Addiction is a really strong piece of ambiguous loss where the person is still alive, but again, who they were, you don't recognize. And they may say and do things now that they never would have previously. And here, it's really important to understand that it's okay and healthy and probably important to grieve the relationship that you had. That there is a heartache and a heartbreak in losing the relationship that you had before that person became unwell or life shifted and changed for them. It's important, and it's important to validate it. All of your emotions are appropriate. And I'm going to say this a lot tonight. All of them are to be expected. The sadness, the yearning for how life was before, the anger at how this happened, either potentially anger at that person, anger at the situation, anger at the illness, the addiction, whatever has changed that person. And it's all valid and it's all okay to feel. You may actually feel almost a sense of guilt at wishing and hoping maybe at some point that that person did die. And that's a really raw and vulnerable thing to say, but I'm going to say it because it's normal, and it's to be to just be acknowledged that that's a really understandable approach. When a person that you love has changed so dramatically, there may be guilt at thinking it would actually be easier if they were gone. And to just feel that, and to just know that that's a normal and appropriate, understandable response. It can be incredibly difficult when the new person, so who they are and how they are presenting now, either they may invalidate your memories of how life was before, or they just may not remember how things were before, and you start to question yourself and doubt of how things really were. And let's talk a little bit about what we do about that, because we want to make sure that the past is actually honored, that those experiences that you had with that person were really real, that those memories that you have were very real and can be honored. And in fact, some people find it very helpful to create scrapbooks or some sort of ritual or some sort of memorial for what that relationship was, to really honor and validate that though it is very different now, it was real and true, and all of the things that you remember it was. There can be a lot of loneliness in ambiguous grief because other people don't recognize it. You may hear things like, well, but he's still alive. I don't understand what the problem is. Or, oh, but she's still here. You still get to see her. And while that is true, there is real pain and there is real grief that's absolutely valid and deserves to be acknowledged here. Remember that, yeah, the present doesn't override the past. It doesn't change the relationship that you had. And so you can really honor those memories. Understand that the injury or the illness or the addiction is not the person. Um, it's okay that at times you're going to get very exasperated and angry at their behaviors, at the way they may be treating you, at the way that they are responding in life now, angry at the situation. You might get angry at them, and that's okay. That's okay. But if there's little tiny windows where you can remember who that person was, the love that you had, is there a possibility for a different kind of relationship? If the change is permanent, then is there a possibility for creating a new relationship that is going to be really different than the one you had? We're not talking about staying in abusive relationships and making the best of a situation if abuse is involved. That's not at all what I'm talking about here, but rather acknowledging that there was great love and there is grief of what was, and reflecting on, is there a new way to relate in this relationship if we continue to be in each other's lives? It will be really important to connect with other people here. Again, because this is a very unspoken about and ununderstood, misunderstood grief, it will be very important to find and connect with people who also are experiencing ambiguous grief, ambiguous loss in the same way, to find a community. We're going to talk about the importance of that later on, but I'll leave that with you. Disenfranchised grief. So this title was kind of created by a researcher called Ken Doka. And Ken said, this is grief when there's been a loss that can't be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, and publicly mourned. So society has a lot of rules about how we should grieve, who we should grieve, how long we should grieve, what our grieving should look like, what relationships that allow grief look like. There are these unspoken and sometimes spoken rules, but they're very hurtful, because the truth is, if you have loved anything or anyone and it is lost, there will be grief. So examples of this, so basically people who are experiencing disenfranchised grief are being denied their right to grieve. Why does this happen? So number one, if the loss isn't seen as worthy. And actually ambiguous grief is one of these, because the person is still alive and people can't understand why you're so heartbroken, because they're still there with you. And so that grief is not seen as valid or as valid. If the relationship is stigmatized. So an example of this may be if a couple is in an extramarital affair and one of the partners dies, that other partner who loved them very deeply will grieve, but they will not be allowed at the funeral, most likely. They may not even have ever told anyone that they're in that relationship, or they may have had a lot of judgment and opinions about the fact that they were in that relationship. But their grief is real. If the love was real, the grief is real. But that is one, most definitely, that is a disenfranchised grief in our society. If the way of death is stigmatized, suicide is a complicated loss, and it can be a disenfranchised grief where there may be judgment from society about how that person died, and that grief is then complicated and mixed up with all sorts of other emotions. If the person grieving is not recognized as valid, so perhaps a coworker who's really on the outskirts of your circles dies, you may grieve them deeply, and yet may feel from society, why in the world are you so sad? You barely knew them. It may be that you hear of someone who is not in your world, but you're aware of them and you hear that they die and you experience deep grief. And disenfranchised grief would say you have no right to grieve. And yet, of course, you do. If there was a sense of loss, then there is grief. Ex-partners, if you've been divorced and separated, maybe even for a long time, and that person passes away, that person dies, there may be judgment of, why in the world would you be crying about that? Why in the world would you be sad? And you just are. But society certainly has its opinions. Isn't society a great thing? And so some other examples of this might be the death of a pet. Don't be silly, stop crying, get another cat, just move on. Divorce. So even if you are the partner who has chosen divorce and asked for divorce, it is still the loss of probably a significant time in your life. And the grief is real and it is valid, but it may not be seen that way. I'm hoping this is changing, but the death of same-sex partners for a long time was disenfranchised grief, and I can imagine in some cultures and some circles it still is. There was certainly a huge barrier to same-sex partners even being allowed to be with their loved ones when they were dying. Real stigmatized by society, these societal norms that stopped the natural flow of grief, that if you love and you lose, there will be grief. And so we want to be able to start talking about this because it's very lonely. Disenfranchised grief is very lonely, but we want to start to name it. Again, having these words, this vocabulary to say that's what's going on. Your grief is real and valid, and society may have judgments. It would be very important in these situations as well to find your community, to find the people who understand, who also grieve, who will say, yes, of course you're heartbroken. Mm-hmm. It will be important to acknowledge that that love was true and significant and your grief is valid. If you are grieving, it means that love was there. It's really that simple. Remind yourself that you are worthy of the time and space to grieve. Find a community. Create your own ritual. If you are not permitted to have the rituals that you need to allow that grief to move through you, create a private ritual for yourself then to honor the loss. Assess your support system. Grief very quickly will change your address book or your contact list. Assess your support system. Who are the people who are going to hold space and honor that this is truly grief? Okay, let's move into anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is grief when we anticipate losing someone. Once a loss or death is a possibility, we begin to grieve. This doesn't happen for everyone. It's not necessary that it happens for anyone, but it is something that's very present for it. I'm very aware of the strength of anticipatory grief. For me, I'm at a time in life where many of people who are close to me are losing their parents. And I, at this point, am really grateful that both my parents are still alive. But every time one of my dearest has a parent who dies, I go into a place of real grieving for them, absolutely. And also a real sense of anticipatory grief about losing my parents. And it was really helpful when I got that label to say, oh, that's what this is. Yep. It's real and valid. And also to know that it can bring anxiety and dread, of course, because it is the thinking of something that has not happened yet, which is ultimately what anxiety is. And so there can be a lot of needing to manage anxiety and dread about that. This will show up in aging, in the people we love aging, in ourselves aging. This will show up if you have any loved ones who are in the military and they get deployed. Anticipatory grief is a very real thing for the family and loved ones of people who are members who are deployed. If you or a person that you love receives a diagnosis, anticipatory grief will likely start. And again, just having the words and knowing that that's the case. And to also know that sometimes there is relief when the anticipatory grief comes to an end and the person actually does die. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the human experience. Relief, okay, now we can deal with this. Accept that it's normal. Acknowledge the losses and really express the emotions about it. Don't be afraid to say, wow, I'm feeling this. You might want to pick your audience, or you might just share it with yourself, but acknowledging it here, connecting with other people who you know are really safe for you to say, I think this is what's going on for me. I think it has a name and I think this is how I'm feeling. Focus on, of course, the meaningful time you have right now. It can be very heartbreaking, and it can really open up an awareness of the preciousness of the time that you have together and how are we going to spend that time. And you might want to communicate with other people who are also experiencing this. So I do think about my past work with military families and how important it was for the spouses who were experiencing anticipatory grief to bring that into the discussion with their children, because their children are feeling grief. Or if you have a loved one or you have a partner who is unwell, that children need this language. Children need to be honored and to have it validated, yeah, that, yeah, this is a normal thing. And in it, really, the key is just self-care. How do you take care of yourself in these times when the people you love are still alive? And I would say that's true of all of these things. And self-care is just part of the grief package. How do we take care of ourselves in this? I will just briefly touch on vicarious grief, which I talked about just in my little introduction there. Vicarious grief is when we see other people grieving or losing and we feel grief. And during COVID, that happened a lot when we saw we continue to see people dying. And if you have a connection with empathy and imagining how other people might be feeling, then just know that vicarious grief is a very real thing and requires the same gentleness and kindness to yourself and self-care and acknowledging, oh, that's what this is. That's what this is. Yeah. This is just a lovely little, well, no, just a quote that I really like about disenfranchised grief, and really any grief that's not given a name, given voice, given the words to speak. So essentially, just to a little bit, I suppose, summarize here, grief is not a pathology. Grief is a human experience to loss. Our society pathologizes it. I get a lot of people saying, I think, maybe so-and-so is, mentally ill or they're struggling, when really, when we figure out there's just been some loss, there's been a lot of grief. Grief is not a pathology. It's not. It's not a problem to be fixed. It's something to be experienced and integrated, but it's not a problem to be fixed. Grief changes you. Any of you who have ever lived and experienced grief, either life losses or death losses, you know that it changes you. And it is a reflection of how deeply you loved. Truly. So I'm just going to check up. There's no questions in the chat box. If anybody has a question that they want to, either just enter it into the chat box, or you can, I think you can put your hand up in your little black box and I'll have a peek there. Okay. Nothing yet. So I will move on. And please do just write them in the chat box if you think of any. Oops. All right. So how do we live with grief? What does it look like and how do we live with it? First, a key message is that there is no normal, or rather it's all normal. All of your feelings are normal and appropriate and valid. I hate saying the word normal because that is a constantly moving and non-real measurement. But anger is understandable and appropriate. Resentment, sadness, fear, anxiety, relief, joy, guilt, they are all part of the package and they are all real and they're all valid. There's no normal to how you feel, how you grieve, what comes up. A lot of people ask these questions. Is it normal that I want to sleep in his t-shirt for a year? Is it normal that I don't want to take her pictures off the wall? Is it normal that sometimes I talk to them and they're gone? Yes, 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 yes. All of it is, because it's all part of your brain trying to make sense of something that does not make sense. I really like this quote here. There is no rule book, there is no time frame, and there should be no judgment. Grief is as individual as a fingerprint, and what we do with it and how we move through it is going to be unique. There are no rule books, unfortunately, which is sometimes tricky for us as humans because we tend to like, here, follow this program and X, Y, or Z will happen. And that's not how grief works. And it's not how we work as humans. It's not how our hearts work. And so coming to a bit of peace with that might be helpful. So what does grief look like? Early grief doesn't really have a time frame. It really doesn't have a sense of like, okay, early grief is the first 6 months or early grief is the first year. That's so unique, absolutely. But what you will notice in the early stages of grief is a very physical response as well as a cognitive experience. So grief is a full body experience. It involves exhaustion. It involves dreams and nightmares. There are actually changes in our body's biochemistry when we experience a loss, especially one that's quite traumatic, or perhaps the ambiguous loss, one that goes on for a very long period of time, or any really. There's a change in our biochemistry, and the brain functions that are responsible for respiration, for digestion, for heart rate, for our nervous system, they all get a little bit out of whack. They all get affected. And so sleep will be altered. Anxiety may be increased because your nervous system is ramped up. You might have heart palpitations. You might feel really nauseous, physical pain. People talk about pain in their muscles, all actually understandable and quote unquote common, I'll use the word common, experiences of what can happen in the early stages of grief. Again, I say early stages, but there's no definition of how long that is. The mind doesn't work the way that it did pre-grief. You will notice a change in the way that you communicate. You will perhaps notice that you forget a lot of words. If you think about times when you're in high stress, it is the same. You're in high stress when there is acute grief, and the brain is essentially just not functioning the way that it does in normal times. There will be confusion. There will be a total loss of time, and that is appropriate and or common. They're very, very common. I remember when I was experiencing a particular loss in my life and was quite devastated and heartbroken. And I remember this person who had done a lot of work in grief saying, grief is its own madness. And somehow that was a really soothing statement for me to just know, yeah, that's what we're in here. Grief is its own madness. Essentially, the mind or the brain is trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. If it's ambiguous loss, if it's disenfranchised loss where society says it's not okay, if it is anticipatory grief where you still see the person, but you know that grief is happening for you, if it is a traumatic loss, if it's any kind of loss that's significant, the mind is trying to make sense of something that does not make sense. And if we can offer ourselves that message and that grace, then it may help us to know, oh, okay, that's what this is. This is a normal response to a big shift in loss. So I just want to check in with you guys, see if you have any questions. Wondering if any of this is, you don't need to share, but if any of this is ringing true for you, resonating for you. When we move out of what we call acute grief or the early stages of grief, oh, I'm just going to pause here to have a look at the chat. Okay, thank you. When we start to move forward into the reality of living with this altered life, so without the thing that we lost in our life losses, with the loss of that dream or planned future, with the an actual death loss, as we begin to move forward out of those initial months, even few years of kind of the shock of it, grief does not no longer exist. There's a phrase that says, as deeply and as long as you loved is as deeply and as long as you're going to grieve. It doesn't disappear. We don't stop grieving. And I do hear that from people. When is this going to end? When is this going to be over? I'm not sure that that's a reasonable expectation. that grief is with us. It changes us. It will shift and it will change over time. But there will be times where a wave will come and knock you over. And those waves might feel just like this. So it might be 5, 10, 15 years down the road, and something comes up for you and a wave knocks you over, and you might find yourself right back in here. Know that you're not losing your mind. Know that this is part of the grief experience and this is how it works. It will shift, it will change, it will change in its sharpness, it will change in its intensity, and at times it will be there and at times it will be softer. Anniversaries can be a challenging time for people, and those could be every sort of an anniversary that you ever had with that person or that experience. It might be their death anniversary, it might be the your wedding anniversary, it might be birthdays, it might be an anniversary of anything significant. There's no rules about this, but anytime you may notice, whoa, it's really strong right now. And then you look at the calendar and think, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. And the makes sense is just validating and normalizing. Oh yeah, there it is. There it is. There are no timelines in grief. I get that question a lot. When will this be over? Or I'm afraid my loved one is stuck. It's 2 years and they still cry when they talk about grandpa. There are no timelines to grief. It is so unique for each person. And there are these ebbs and flows that we move through, and that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that. This is something I wanted to share with you. So Lauren Herschel went on Twitter. This was, I'm not sure how many years ago, to be honest. And she was talking about her experience with grief. And she said, so grief is like this. There's a box with a ball in it and a pain button. And she says, no, I'm not known for her art skills. In the beginning, the ball is huge. Early stages of grief. You can't move the box without that ball hitting the pain button. It rattles around on its own in there and it hits the button over and over. You can't control it. It just keeps hurting. And sometimes it seems unrelenting. And over time, unique for each person, the ball gets smaller. It never goes away, but it hits the button less and less because there's more room in the box. But when it does, it hurts just as much. It's better because you can function day to day a little more easily some days. But the downside is that that ball randomly hits that button when you least expect it. A song comes on the radio. You all can think, I'm sure, of so many things. I won't take the time to list what those could be, that button. And that's when that wave hits. And that's when you just like, whoa, there is that. And you notice it. And in those times, you go to that place of self-care. You go to the place of nurturing yourself and honoring, oh, there's grief again. Okay. Mm-hmm. I just want to share that with you. I thought that was a really great visual. So how do we live with it? We know what it looks like. How do we live with it? Always, always, always. And any of you who know me in any way know that I'm always talking about the importance of gentleness, being kind to ourselves. And in grief, it is absolutely a priority. It can't be skipped, can't not be important. Basically, in the early days, well, this is true of anything. I'm going to say this as a therapist. Any unacknowledged and unspoken and pushed down pain does not go away. We don't work that way. Unfortunately, humans do not work that way. I know a lot of people wish that was the case, but it's not the case, unfortunately. So if it is unheard, it doesn't go away. We need to allow it to exist. We need to name it. This is anger. This is heartache. This is grief. This is resentment. We need to name it and we need to be with it. We need to tend to it without fixing it. Grief cannot be fixed. It must be tended. It must be held. It must be seen. It must be named. The grief experiment essentially is in each moment, what do I need right now? And I love this division of what needs tending to and what needs adjusting. So when pain comes up, does this actually just need me to be with it? To just put my hand on my heart and say, oh, this is grief? To just tend it and be with it? Or does it need adjusting? Is there something in your life that needs to be changed that might make things feel a little bit lighter, a little bit more well? Megan Devine, who I will talk about many times through this presentation and share her book with you, talks about when her partner died very, very suddenly. She adjusted that going to the grocery store during regular hours was way too painful. She could not handle conversations that people would have, the awkward things that people would say. Even being there was extremely painful for her. And so she adjusted in a couple of ways. Number one, she started going to a grocery store that she and her partner had never been to. And number two, she started going at 11 o'clock at night when it was still open. So she wouldn't run into anybody who would ask her questions, who would ask for explanations, who would offer her compassion that she just didn't feel that she could take. So in that's just one example of knowing, is this something that needs to be tended to, or is there something here that can be adjusted? And in each moment, you're going to be evaluating and assessing, and there's no right or wrong way. This is where you have to let go of, is this polite? Is this kind? Is this okay? Unless you're asking those questions about yourself. Is this what I need? Is this kind for me? In these early days of grief, you need to just take care of you. Now, I'm speaking, of course, if you have children, if you have other people that you care for, that you're responsible for, that will come into factor. But this is, I'm just talking about your own internal experience here. In early stages of grief, there can be a lot of cognitions that come up that might be quite provoking. A lot of fear, maybe of, who else am I going to lose? Or am I going to, if it was a tragic death, is this something that could happen to me? Be very aware of your thoughts. Is this thought bringing me wellness, or is this thought bringing me worseness? And working with our thoughts can be very challenging. Anyone who's ever done any of that knows that. But in grief, just to be aware, oh, is this thought that I'm having bringing me wellness or bringing me worseness? And it kind of might be, again, a checking in moment by moment here. I really want to say here in early grief, exhaustion is probably the number one experience. And so really, I'm sharing these things with you, but in early grief, you're going to do whatever you need to. And if that's sleeping, then you're going to do that. If that's picking one thing that helps you feel better, you're going to do that. I'm just sharing a lot of things here, but it's really just honoring yourself. Rituals are very important. The research shows that people who engage with rituals move through grief in a way that's a little bit less, I'm going to say sticky, I guess. It doesn't make the grief any less, but there are greater mental health outcomes, I suppose. People struggle less with mental health if there have been the opportunities to have rituals. This is something that, of course, was very difficult during COVID, when the rituals that people would do were absolutely prohibited for the first year, especially when we were in total lockdown. If that is the case, it's important that you create your own rituals then. If you are not allowed to honor the rituals that society says are there for the taking, then you create your own, whatever that might be. There's no right or wrong here, but reflecting on what that might be, creating memorials, having rituals with other people who loved that person, if it is a death loss, or anything that comes up for you. Sometimes, especially in the early days of grief, it will just be too much to be in that place all of the time. And so if you find any little window of a grief break, any little window that allows you to breathe for a moment, to forget for a moment, there may be guilt that comes up when you do actually forget, or where you have a moment where you experience joy. I hear many people have that. I feel so guilty, I shouldn't be feeling joyful. I feel so guilty, I shouldn't be laughing. I feel so guilty, I shouldn't be. We need to get rid of those judgments. Grief is very heavy, and we need breaks from it at times. So anything that in those days brings little windows of joy, move toward it, even if it's just for a few moments of breathing differently. Give yourself permission. That will sustain you. And moving through. Taking distance and space is really about, gosh, especially this time of year, the holidays, when there are a lot of social expectations about where you should be and who you should be with and how you should be. But any time of year, take the space and the distance you need. There will be loved ones who come into your life who say you shouldn't be alone, or we're worried you're spending too much time alone. Especially in the early days, you do what you need to do. I mean, many people need to just really be with themselves in grief. Grief is very personal. It's very private. And in as much as people are around you supporting you, your grief is your grief. And there may be a desperate need for silence, or a desperate need to go wander around in nature by yourself, you and the trees, or whatever it is. Taking the distance and space as you need it. In terms of changing things, people will have opinions about how fast you should clean out closets, about how fast you should throw things out, about how fast you should move furniture around. Quite frankly, it's nobody else's business except yours, if you are the person who has lost. And that can be true of anything. If you have lost pets, people will have opinions about how soon you should get a new one. Don't change anything until you're ready. If you have lost a relationship, people think you should start dating soon. If you have, lost a job, people may think that you should jump back in. Change things only when you are ready. I think that it is Megan who talks about the vomit metric. So let's say it is time for you to clean, or you're thinking about cleaning out your loved one's closet. And if you look at that and it makes you want to vomit, she says, then the time is not right. Wait until you can come back and look at that task and not feel like you're going to toss your cookies. That's her advice on how to know when you're ready, but it'll be very individual and unique for you. There are no timelines, and I'm just going to say that over and over again. So you will move through grief at your own time, your own space. Pain is not going to let go until it's ready to. Unfortunately, that sounds like a hard thing, but it will be there until it softens, and there's really nothing to do that can speed that up. That being said, allowing is probably going to allow movement through, expressing it, talking about it, sharing your stories. Sharing stories is vitally important. Telling those stories over and over is actually the mind trying to make sense, the mind trying to put together what has just happened. You're probably going to want to pick the right audience. You're probably going to want to be making sure that you have the people around you who can hold space for that. But there are no timelines. And if you need to still be telling that story a few years down the road, then so be it. That's part of the healing. Companionship is vitally important. And I did touch on that when we were talking about the types of losses there. Making sure that there is a community of people who get it, people who are going through it. I've heard it said, look for the tribe of after, or maybe even more importantly, the tribe of during. Who are the people, the community, the connections, support groups, loved ones, friends, people who have gone through similar, who can say, yeah, I get it. And just hold space for you, not need to fix it because they know it can't be fixed. This is not about overcoming grief. This is not about getting over it. Rather, it is about integrating that loss reality of life in a very different way, whether that's a life loss or a death loss. It's knowing that you are changed because you loved and lost. And it's moving through life with that new weave in your fabric. There is no going back to how it was before, because we are changed by what we love and lose, but there is an integration. There can be a making room for it. This is a time not in immediate grief, not in acute grief, but down the road where there is reflection, where you are pondering the times that you had together, the good, bad, and ugly. It's really, really important in grief work that we acknowledge in the case of death losses, what was not good as well as what was good. The risk of putting a person who's gone on a pedestal is not, it's dangerous. It's dangerous. And we actually want to acknowledge the good, the bad, and the ugly, because that was part of the real story. There can be something when we look back on the past called euphoric recall, where we only recall the things that brought euphoria. But a holistic, integrated perspective and an integrated wellness is the whole story. The things you loved and the things that drove you crazy. And that could be about jobs that you've lost. It could be about relationships that you could lost. It could be about all sorts of things, but really important to have that balanced perspective there. I just want to share this as a tool for reflection. This is called a loss cluster. And what happens is that when we have a loss, so a significant primary loss, so in this model, the primary loss that my mom died, that tends to be the one that society thinks about, that we spend a lot of time, really kind of aware of, but there are always secondary losses. So I'm thinking about let's say a teenager whose mom dies, and the secondary loss being my dad shut down. So I actually lost my dad. And when he shut down, he actually lost his job, which means that, we actually had to move to a new house, and I really hate it. I lost my bedroom. I lost my place that felt so safe to me. I lost my dad, who was actually like my playmate. We used to go out biking all the time, and now he's so sad and depressed. So we never go biking. I lost my friend of my dad there. And we had to move. We had to move to this new house because dad lost his job. So I lost all my friends. And now I'm starting over, and I really loved that teacher, and I was looking forward to graduating in that school. So it can be really important and a really powerful reflective tool to know, what is my loss cluster? You may be very aware of your primary loss, but what are the losses that resulted? Not as a way of looking for darkness or, looking for more despair, but each of these losses needs to be acknowledged. It needs to be felt. It needs to be expressed and labeled. The power of saying, oh, wow, yeah. And sometimes a secondary loss can be actually more grievous or just as grievous as the first loss. Mom died, that's very grievous. And I lost my best friends because we had to move to a house, across the province. And I lost that dream of graduating from my high school with the people I went to school with since kindergarten. Those need to be honored and felt and seen. So I just wanted to share that as a reflective tool that might be helpful for you if you're ever working through grief or the people you love are. I want to touch briefly on the stages of grief. So this is a pretty popular model in the grief world. There's a lot of research that's sort of shifting away from this idea. So originally, it was the 5 stages of death and dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the 5 stages of death and dying. And it got changed into the 5 stages of grief and grieving. But originally, the 5, which were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, were about when you are diagnosed and you are dying. It seemed like a nicely packaged model, and so it kind of transferred over to the people who were grieving. But what we know is that grief is not linear. I didn't put any arrows on this circle because guess what? They can go from one to the other, back and forth many, many times. So David Kessler, this is another book I'm going to share with you. David Kessler is a writer who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross before she died, and they wrote some of their books together, and he has continued his work. And what he says is that this was never supposed to be prescriptive. It is descriptive. And if it gives some help in saying, oh man, I am in such a state of anger right now, and that helps you acknowledge where you are in your grief, great. If you have a day where you're so low and you're like, oh, this is depression, and that helps you, great. But the important piece being, each person's grief is entirely different. There's no way we can predict how things are going to go. And you may go from denial into bargaining. You might actually move into acceptance one day where you wake up and you're just like, yeah, I know this is real. And then the next day you are so angry about it. We will go back and forth all of the time. And that's how humans work. That's how we work in our emotions. And that's definitely how we work in grief. Now, David Kessler added a sixth stage, which is essentially making meaning. And making meaning is, he says, in his experiences from his losses, what comes after acceptance. And it may come years after the initial loss, years and years. And I just want to read a couple of things, what he said. So in the sixth stage, we acknowledge that although for most of us, grief will lessen in intensity over time, it will never end. But if we allow ourselves to move into the sixth stage, meaning, it may allow us to transform grief into something else, something rich and fulfilling. Meaning helps us make sense of grief. And what does meaning look like? It can take many shapes, such as finding gratitude for the time you had with your loved ones, or finding ways to commemorate or honor them, or realizing the brevity and value of life and making the springboard into some kind of major shift or change. Where am I to find meaning? Is it in their death? Is it in the loss? Is it in the event? Is it in the life of the person I loved? Or am I trying to find meaning in my own life after the loss? Any of those. Any of those. We want to be very careful that this is not rushed into the early stages of grief. Again, this may be months or years down the road. And this is not, oh, there must be a purpose in why they died. Rather, this is, what am I going to do with life now that they are gone, in a way that brings a sense of a little more thriving, I suppose. So I just wanted to share that with you because it is a model that's talked about a lot in grief. It's only effective if it is helpful for you, and it's only effective if we understand that there are no rules. Everything that you experience is normal, and to expect it to be linear will only lead to disappointment and a probable repression of what's actually going on. All right, how are we doing for time? Okay, so 8 o'clock, we have about half an hour left. So we'll go through the next little one, and I do want to send some time for questions at the end if you have them. I did just want to include this slide because it is December, and some faiths have already had holidays that have passed. Some faiths are moving into and continuing into a holiday season. Really important here to be incredibly gentle with yourself. So whether you are living currently with ambiguous loss, whether you are living currently with anticipatory grief or disenfranchised grief, or acute, have just lost someone or lost someone years ago and still know that that loss is with you, be really gentle, protect yourself, say no, rest, whatever it is that you need to do to take care of yourself. If that's getting into nature, if that soothes you, all of the things. Don't do more than you want, and do only what feels good and helpful for you. Have a plan A and a plan B. Maybe plan A is to go to a family turkey dinner, and maybe plan B is to say, nope, I'm going to the movies by myself. And maybe you're going to cancel both of those and you're just going to stay home. You have full permission to do whatever you need. All of us should have full permission to do whatever we need to do in the holidays. But during grief, just really, especially the early days, really honor what you need. Again, day by day. People may have opinions and they're going to have ideas about how you should be, could be, ought to be. Not important. Really honor what's important for you. Feel the feelings, all of them. If we repress, if we suppress, we are going to cause suffering. If we allow them to be there, the anger, the hurt, the sadness, the loneliness, we need to tend, we need to be with, to say, yes, this makes sense. Yep, this is what I'm feeling. Talk about your loved ones if you want to. Maybe normalize that. Some of your people who won't know how to handle grief may think, oh, we can never talk about, you know, the loss, whether it's a life loss or a death loss. If it's okay with you and you want to, talk about it. Talk about your feelings. Again, you're going to know your audience really quickly. This is going to clean out your contact list. This is going to really clarify for you who are the people that you can trust, I suppose, with what you're going through. Do pay attention to the children who are grieving. Really difficult time for little ones, a lot of confusion for little ones, and this season, season of joy, if that's what it is meant to be in society. And then seeing the adults in their life sad, or knowing that they're also feeling sadness, it can be really helpful to embrace the idea, and I talk a lot about this, of both and. I can feel very sad that I miss so-and-so, and I can also be really delighted that I'm getting presents. I'm thinking about a child's perspective, that if we can normalize for children that both can exist, what a gift, that things are not black or white. We are not beings who only feel one emotion at a time, that there can be that holding of both and. This is actually a really nice segue into our next section, which is, if you have a friend in grief, don't ask if you can help, or don't ask if you should help. Just do. Find out ways that if what they need, maybe they need someone to just come and clean their house or do their laundry. Maybe they need someone to think about just having some food delivered to their house. Maybe they need someone to arrange to have the snow shoveled. Maybe they do want to go out, and be okay if they say no. If you invite them out for coffee, or you say, you know what, why don't you come over for an evening? Be okay if they say no. One thing that I read recently about the holidays specifically, though, is that if you are going to invite someone who's had a recent loss, that you let them know that you know about their grief, and that their grief is welcome. However that feels true for you, but just saying, yeah, I know this is a heartbreaking time for you, and you know what, your grief is welcome here. You're welcome, and your grief is here. No need to put on a happy face. Mm-hmm. And so that does segue us really quite nicely into this. And I just really appreciate this quote here. You can't fix me or my grief. Please don't try. You can't motivationally speak me out of my funk. It's actually not a funk. It's my reality. You can't tough love me into letting go or moving on. Neither are possible. Just love me and let me be right where I'm at. If you can't do that, kindly exit stage left. So this is a chart that is Megan Devine's, sorry, I always mix her name up, Megan Devine here. I don't think it's in the book, but it's in I think on one of her websites. So when someone else is grieving, here's a lovely little list of do's and don'ts. Don't compare griefs. Oh yeah, gosh, me too. Oh my goodness, when when that happened to me, I blah, 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 blah. Don't. Just ask them what it's like for them. Don't fact check. Are you sure that's how it happened? But I heard it went down like this, and I don't think that's really true. Oof, just let them have it. Not the time. Keep your opinions to yourself. Ooh, this is a big one. Very often it can be like, oh, you're so brave. Wow, I really admire how you're handling this. You're so brave. This is such a terrible time. You're being so brave. They don't want to have to be brave. You know that, right? When you're grieving, you don't want to have to be brave. Wouldn't it be so lovely to be able to be messy? Share the things you love about the person who's been lost, or the situation if it's a life loss. Remind them that you're there, and let them be a mess. Don't be a cheerleader, but mirror back. Yeah, this does suck. Use their language. They're like, oh my God, this sucks. Yeah, it does. Do you want to tell me about it? So destructive when someone tries to bring rainbows and butterflies. Really, you just need to be there with them. Try and stay with them in the present, talking about how they're going to find love again, or things are going to get better, or you'll feel better next year. Not helpful at all. You know that from your experiences of being the griever. And this is such a beautiful question that can be used in any human interaction. Are you wanting empathy, or are you wanting a strategy right now? Imagine if we communicated that with each other. Do you just want me to sit here and be with you, or do you actually want me to problem solve with you? You can take a little print screen of any of these if you'd like, and you'll have the recording. So here's just a little list. And I think really we could start with number 8. Just love them. The grief belongs to them. And so you're going to follow their lead, whatever it looks like. If they are texting you regularly, text them regularly. If they are wanting to spend time with them, follow their lead. If they're wanting some space, let them know you're there and give them their space. State the truth. Avoid platitudes. That's the cheerleading. Just be with them. Yep, this hurts and I love you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that I remember learning was to stay away from the phrase "at least." Probably the most invalidating sentence. Well, at least you got to love him. At least you had 40 years together. At least I'm thinking about miscarriages, and that's a very unspoken about grief. At least you knew you could get pregnant, right? Those at leasts are devastating. So stay away from those. Don't try to fix. Anticipate their needs, especially in the early days. They won't have a clue. They won't have a clue what they need often. So if it might just be simple things like, again, if you're close enough and you show up at their house and you do their laundry, if they want you to, but do check with them first. So before you go and you do their laundry, make sure that this isn't, one of their loved ones' favorite shirts that they're saving because they really want that smell close to them. Ask that, ordering in food for them, getting a snow removal company. I think these things I've said already. Running interference, if you know that they have people in their life that really quite overwhelm them, then maybe running interference. And educating and advocating. I mean, tonight you and I have talked about a lot of things. I hope there's at least one thing that you're taking away tonight that was new. Let's have conversations about grief in society. Let's educate people more and more about how we can support each other in something that is just such a human experience. And if we share that information, maybe people will be less awkward and say less hurtful things. Very often, I know that people say hurtful things unintentionally, and their intention is to just try and fix things. But to a person who's in acute grief, someone trying to solve the problem, the message is, I'm not comfortable with your suffering. I need to fix you. And really, we just need to be with them in their suffering. We just need to be with them. It's not comfortable and it's awkward, and that's okay. Stay with the awkwardness. Be in the awkwardness of just being with them in something that is heartbreaking and doesn't make sense and can't be explained away. That's the biggest gift we can give each other in being human. So what if you're the griever? There may be some people that you want to share some of this information with. There may be some people that you want to say, it is not helpful for me when you tell me to cheer up. It is not helpful for me when you X, Y, or Z. Decide who you want to educate and inform. When you're the griever, again, you're going to determine who are going to be your safe places. And those may be the people that you want to say, actually, I need you to do this. Or actually, I cannot stand it when you do that. You may not be able to articulate that in the early stages, and that's okay. But decide who you want to, and safely ignore who you don't want to engage with. You have the right to. You have the right. I mean, shouldn't we all have the right? But you have the right, especially as a griever, an early stages griever, to decide, no, I do not have space for that person. And you don't answer the texts and you don't answer the calls, and that's fully within your right. Decide who can handle your story with respect and love. You're going to probably, maybe, possibly want to tell that story over and over and over, and that's okay. That's part, again, of making sense of what doesn't make sense. Decide who can handle that. Who's going to respond in that way that feels loving and feels accepting and feels open. People are going to have opinions about how you should grieve, what you should be doing, when you should be doing it, what timeline you should be doing it. Let them know that your grief is not up to debate. And I love this phrase. I appreciate your interest in my life. I'm going to live this way that feels right to me, and I'm not interested in discussing it. I'm happy to talk with you about something else, but I'm not open to this discussion. And more simply, that isn't a topic I'll discuss. And these may seem impossible. How would I ever say these things? But this may be a way to survive, to be able to set those clear boundaries of like, no, this is, I actually don't want to hear your opinion about what I should be doing differently or how I should be doing X, Y, or Z. Yeah, you're allowed to say these things to take care of you. In terms of the responding, as the person who is supporting someone who's grieving, just know that there actually are no right things to say. People say that all the time, what should I say? What's the right thing to say? There isn't anything to say except to be with them and to echo what they're saying, and to be awkward. That's your job, just to show up and be awkward. And you can educate people that you need them just to show up and be there with you. So these are just some resources here that I popped up. So Megan Devine has several books. She actually has a beautiful journal right now, or like a writing experience if you are moving through grief. This is one that I recommend to a lot of people. She has, if you're more into the web, she has a great website with tons of resources. If you're on Facebook, she has a Facebook page called Refuge in Grief, and she posts stuff up there. She has TED Talks if you YouTube her. David Kessler is the author, the researcher who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and he has a lot of beautiful work. He lost his 21-year-old son died. His son died when he was 21, and I do believe both of his parents have died. And yeah, so he has a lot of really beautiful writing and a lot of lived experience. And then another book that I've been reading recently, which is quite beautiful, is Joanne Cacciatore, Bearing the Unbearable, and it has some really lovely things in it as well. In the early stages of grief, and I didn't say this, reading might be right out the window. It might not even be accessible to you, and that's okay. That's okay. Your brain is not where it typically is, even if you are a big reader and you love reading during the early stages of grief, that just might not be a reality for you, and that's okay. You actually probably don't need to do any learning in the early stages of grief. You just need to be tending to, and there may be a time in life where you want to read some more, or you have people in your life who are experiencing grief and you want to know how to support them, or what this thing is, or people who you want to refer these things to. Websites, I found some there. Kidsgrief.ca is a really great one for parents knowing how to support their kids. Mygrief.ca actually has little modules, little learning modules where you can click. I think there's 9 different modules on what grief looks like. Soaringspirits.ca, specifically for widows. I think it's American. Kids Grief, My Grief, and Alts.org are Canadian. Modernloss.com is American. And it's really actually just peer conversations about grief. So if you're curious about them, they do have different categories of, losses, I suppose, that are interesting if you are curious about that. Alts.org is the Alzheimer's Society's website, and they have several drop-down messages or drop-down menus, help-support, and then it says something about caregivers, and then there is one specifically about grief and grieving when you have a partner who is living with dementia, that ambiguous grief. There are many other resources. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. Many, many others. These are just ones that stand out for me and that I want to give credit to for this presentation. So ultimately, I'm going to end the recording after I do this, and then we can open up for some questions if anybody would like. We're just about 20 minutes after 8. Life and death losses are hard. It just is. It's heartbreaking and difficult, and they just need to be experienced and felt and acknowledged. All of your feelings need to be validated. They need to be expressed. They need to be felt. Anything that we push down becomes sticky. It hangs on to us much longer. Grief isn't going to go anywhere, but it will change. And the intensity and the sharpness of it will change. And the amount of times that little ball hits the pain buzzer will change with time. But each one of those losses that we talked about, each one of the emotions does need to be said and named. The most beautiful thing happens. They've done these beautiful scans of the brain where the moment someone is able to say the word to label, oh, this is grief, oh, this is anger, oh, this is sorrow, the intensity of the heat in that part of the brain begins to cool. That's what these brain scans show, that they might be red hot. And when someone says, oh, this is sorrow, oh, I'm feeling grief, there's actually a cooling in the intensity in those brain centers, really powerful in your nervous system to be able to honor and acknowledge what's going on. Gentleness and kindness is number one for yourself and for the ones that you love who are experiencing grief, of course. It's okay that you're not okay. If you've experienced loss, it's okay that you're not okay. Death losses, life losses, COVID losses. It's okay that we're not okay. Grief isn't a problem to be solved. You will be changed by it. And you can integrate and live with the new reality. It will be different. It might have a tinge of sorrow that wasn't there before. And that is part of your story of being human. So I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop the recording now and open it up for questions. You can choose to do that over the chat or pop on as you wish. But I thank you for being here. I hope that some of this was helpful for you, whether it was just the normalizing, whether it was learning tools and strategies, whether it was just hearing, oh, that's what this is. None of us escape. If we choose to love anything or anyone in this world, we will experience grief and we can move through it. So I'm going to end there now. Thank you. Okay, just give me 1 second to end the recording.